Hello, thank you for joining us today. I'm Laura Kunkel, America in Bloom's Executive Director. America in Bloom has been around for more than 2 decades. We envision communities across the country as welcoming and vibrant places to live, work, and play, benefiting from colorful plants and trees, enjoying clean environments, celebrating heritage, and planting pride through volunteerism. Through our programs, grant opportunities, online resources, and the sharing of best ideas from towns and cities across the country, we empower communities to beautify and improve the overall quality of life. Today's webinar is an example of one of the ways that America in Bloom shares information to help communities become more beautiful and vibrant. You can learn more about America in Bloom by visiting our website at americainbloom.org. A quick housekeeping note, if you have questions during the webinar, please put them in the Q&A section of your Zoom toolbar. We'll answer questions at the end. And for today's webinar, we are honored to have George Grant here to teach us about the wonderful world of plant nutrition. George has degrees in horticulture from the University of Georgia and the University of Florida. He is the GGS Pro Technical Services Manager with Greenhouse Griffin Supplies. GGS Pro assists growers of all sizes and backgrounds across the country with their cultivation issues, ranging from sanitation, IPM, fertility, lighting, and water quality. We are grateful to him for being with us today. Take it away, George.
Thanks, Laura. And I just want to say thank you again for American Bloom for allowing me to speak today. You're probably wondering at this point, well, how does fly fishing have anything to do with plant nutrition? And I tend to actually start my presentations as it relates to just producing plants with fly fishing, because surprisingly, there is quite a bit of overlap. And in this situation, as it pertains to today, whenever you walk up to a body of water to fish, it's very similar to working with any type of grower as it relates to fertilizer formation or fertilizer program formation. So the reality is not everybody has the best water. Now, water is going to be the primary sort of tool we work around to formulate a appropriate fertilizer program for your specific situation. Sometimes water is very good and it's perfect for growing plants, but in most situations, it's actually very challenging to work with. And it's frankly, as it starts, it's not the best on its face for growing plants adequately. And also, there's situations where water seems to give us some things we're not expecting. But that doesn't mean that we can't produce quality plants with the water we're starting with. Now, basically, regardless of what the situation is, we have to always consider the situation. We have to consider what you're trying to grow, what type of water quality you have, what your production scheme, really what your objectives are. And ultimately, I love that American Bloom reached out to me because I personally have a passion for community development as well. And as a technical specialist, our goal on a daily basis is to basically give the agency or capacity to growers in this situation, anyone listening. Our objective is to educate you so you can make decisions on your own and be confident in those decisions. So GGS Pro is basically the technical arm for Griffin Greenhouse Supplies. We're a single source, family owned distributor for basically everything under the sun you can imagine that you need to grow plants, ranging from construction, hard goods, retail, you name it, we do it. Now, GGS Pro, we are a technical team of 6, and we do write a lot and we do speak a lot. There's a few different resources we're going to talk about today that are readily available, but also if you're looking to dive in a little bit more, regardless of your background or what level of production you're in, there's a variety of resources actually shown on this slide here. Feel free to reach out to GGS Pro or look up on the Griffin website. There's a lot of different educational resources we have available for you. So I'm very grateful. I've been blessed with great mentors, and I've also been blessed with a great team. So as you can see, we've got a team of 6, including myself, and we're spread out all over the United States. Fortunately, it's amazing what you can do with a cell phone and email. We're able to help, I would say, over 50 growers a day, ranging from every type of production scheme, ornamentals, edibles, herbs, you name it, we do it. And we're able to do it in a seat. And the way we do that is we do things through communication. Now, my fiance would say that I do the first type of communication very well, but not the second type. But there's a third type of communication that we really, really highlight that I think gets overlooked quite a bit. And that's the art of questioning. Now, we call this peeling the onion. Whenever I communicate with a grower or a homeowner, whatever it may be, I'm going to ask a variety of questions. And it allows me to kind of get an idea of really what's the situation. It depends regardless if it's a problem at hand or an objective that you're looking to seek out. Now, this is an aside. This really doesn't have anything to do with plant nutrition on its face, but I want you all to think about this next time you walk into the greenhouse or walk out into the garden and you see something you don't think seems right. And that is when you try to identify a problem, look for the primary issue. And then when I say primary issue, it's what is actually the root cause of that problem. Oftentimes we see things that are secondary or tertiary issue, and we try to correct what we're seeing, but oftentimes we don't do enough investigation to figure out what's actually going on in the situation. In this particular photo, which I love to use in my presentations, it tells a really good story. This is a poinsettia that was transplanted into soil and it never took off. So what the grower did is they took that liner out of the soil and they dusted off the roots. And then we can actually see what's going on. We can see that the roots are damaged from Pythium, which is a common root rot. But if we look a little bit closer, we can actually see these little white worms. These are fungus gnat larvae, and they predate on root systems. It's actually the fungus gnat larva that's predating on the root system, damaging that root system, and allowing a secondary pathogen to come in, as you can see here. All right, well, that all aside, let's jump into this. We are definitely going to go the full hour. And as Laura said, if you have any questions, please type them in. And if you have any questions regarding this presentation or anything that comes up in the future, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'll provide my contact information at the very end of the presentation. So what are we going to be discussing today? Well, we're going to start very basic, and then we're going to kind of work our way up in complexity. We're going to first talk about what is fertilizer and what do we mean when we say fertilizer, how to read a fertilizer label, which is an incredibly valuable tool. Also, I'm going to tell you how to read a water test and what are the important things we need to look for when we look at a water test. Forming a fertilizer program. This is a very complex and contextual thing, but the sort of the elements that we talk about before that hopefully helps you wrap your head around as far as what we think about when we're trying to formulate a fertilizer program. And then we'll round it off with some common nutritional issues that we see almost on a daily basis. Okay, so when we talk about fertilizer, we talk about the essential plant nutrients. Now, this is the generalized list, and there's a few these other nutrients that aren't on this slide that are up for debate. But in general, when we talk about plant essential nutrients, these are how they're categorized. So our macronutrients, which we call macros, secondary nutrients, and then micronutrients or micros. Now I'm going to try to use some lingo or some professional lingo or slang we use in the industry, just so you have an idea of, if you read those terms or hear those terms, you might have an idea of what they mean in future conversations. But here's the three major categories of plant nutrients that we work with. Now, when you look at a fertilizer label or a fertilizer bag, it's going to have typically three numbers on it. Now, those numbers are NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are, once again, the primary macronutrients we're going to work with. They're called macronutrients because of the primary nutrients that a plant needs. They're going to need the highest quantity of these nutrients, or that plant's going to come to a screeching stall as far as growth is concerned. So when we look at the sources of these macronutrients, they can be taken up in three primary ways. Under nitrogen, it's nitrate, ammonium, and urea. Under phosphorus, it's going to be phosphate. And then potassium, it'll be denoted as potash or K2O. Now, P2O5 and K2O, you will see them on fertilizer labels, but frankly, the plant takes up the basically a phosphate ion and a potassium ion. All of the salts that plants take up are on an ionized state, meaning they have a plus or negative attached to their compound or element. Now, this isn't going to be a chemistry lecture, but I want to use some chemistry terms so you have an idea of how plant nutrition really works. This is a little snippet on this slide of a 13-11-11 fertilizer label, and it just gives you an idea of how that can be denoted on a label as far as its NPK is concerned. So fertilizer name, once again, when you read a label, it's going to have three numbers, and that gives you kind of an idea of what's going on from a macronutrient standpoint, but you definitely have to look more into the label to give you an idea of what else is in that fertilizer. A lot of people just go off those three numbers, and frankly, that's just not enough to tell us what's going on or if that's the appropriate fertilizer for our needs. It also doesn't tell us if it's a liquid or solid. We'll talk about fertilizer forms here in a little bit, but once again, if just saying 10-10-10 or 20-20 triple-20 really doesn't tell us too much about that fertilizer on its face. We get this question all the time. It's, what's the best fertilizer? Now, that's a good question, but the better question is, what's the best fertilizer for my situation? And for us to figure that out, we ask a variety of questions, as some of these are bulleted here. What's the type of crop? Where is your location? Are you growing in a container media? Are you growing in the field soil? Also, with the type of crops you're growing, what range of crops are you growing? Are you growing just a small variety or a huge range of crops? These are certain questions that really help us determine what's the best fertilizer for your situation. Okay, now equate this to baking a cake. Okay, when you look at a fertilizer label, and we'll look at a few here, but when you look at a fertilizer, it's not just one ingredient. It's going to be a combination of ingredients, or what we call straights. And now, once again, these are all, and here's a variety of ones listed here that are kind of the major common ones we see that attribute to our macronutrients. So NPK, MAP, potassium sulfate, calcium nitrate, uh, potassium nitrate. These are going to be very common in most of your water soluble fertilizers, as well as your control release fertilizers. Here's some other ones you might see as well, and I've kind of highlighted or colored what nutrients you're getting. As you can see here, now ammonium sulfate or calcium nitrate, any of these really, once they dissolve in water, they dissociate, meaning they separate and they become ionized. They become a plant available. So when calcium nitrate dissolves in water, it becomes calcium and nitrate. Both of those are plant available. So when we formulate fertilizers, or when we're looking at fertilizers, they're going to have a combination of ingredients or fertilizer traits, and it's based on those combination of ingredients and the concentration that's in them that determines if it's an appropriate fertilizer for our needs. So when we can categorize fertilizer in a lot of different ways. A common one I think comes up in house owners or for homeowners or uh, just landscape producers is an organic or conventional fertilizer. Okay, now organic can mean a lot of different things. For the purpose of our conversation and the purpose of professional production, organic means OMRI or OMRI certification, which is basically the highest standard of organic certification you can get in the United States. Conventional fertilizer is going to be basically everything that's not organic. Now, also, how can we apply fertilizer? This is a big one. What's the type of way I'm planning to apply the fertilizer will help me dictate my fertilizer choice. Now, there's a few different types of ways to apply fertilizers I've listed here, and I bolded two that are really the ones that aren't utilized enough at the homeowner level or small gardener level. The top three bullets are definitely ways that I would say the average home grower uses, but the bottom two, and I think are the most powerful ways to use it, these are how we use fertilizer in the professional level. We're going to focus on both of these in a little more detail. So we've talked about water soluble fertilizers a little bit. I've alluded to them, but there's two. Once again, another way we can categorize fertilizers is I can dissolve them in water and then apply them directly to the root zone, or I can use something called a control release fertilizer or CRF. Now, this, as we'll see a photo here in a moment, is kind of like a prill. It's a little ball, and inside that little prill is fertilizer salts. Now, you probably have seen this if you've ever gone to like Lowe's or Home Depot, gotten some sort of a complete soil media. You probably have seen these little green, orange, red, sort of whitish little balls in the soil itself, and that's control release fertilizer. So these are very useful for a variety of reasons. One, I can pre-incorporate them. If I'm mixing up my own soil, I can put them in there uniformly, or I can top dress them. Those are the two primary ways we use this type of fertilizer. It's really good if I don't have ways to constantly apply water soluble fertilizer. This is a very easy way and not very labor intensive way to apply nutrition. And here's a photo here on the bottom right-hand corner. This is what control release fertilizer or CRFs look like. Now they're basically they're coated in some way. So we're taking fertilizer salts and we're coating them in some way. And this coating technology, it allows nutrients to be released in a much more controlled way. And it's primarily based on water and temperature. The more water I have available and the higher temperatures I have available, the more the rate of nutrient release I'm getting. But there's a lot of different CRFs available out there, and using this sort of technology allows us to basically apply CRFs in almost any type of situation. Now, it's very important when you're looking at CRFs, though, you need to look at the label, just like we're talking about everything else. When you at a product, before you buy it, first thing you do is turn it around and look at the label. It tells you what's actually in that product. CRFs are the same thing. Now, in the top left-hand corner, you can see it says 15,9,12, which once again tells us the NPK. And then under it says 5 to 6 month. Now, this is very important. With CRFs, it's going to tell you the release time. It basically tells you in general terms, how long is that CRF going to last? How long is that fertilizer going to last? And in this case, it's a 5 to 6 month process for a product. But also what it might do, and more advanced CRF products will do this, it will actually tell you how the release curve changes depending on the temperature. And as we said before, higher temperatures means a quicker release. And so that's important information to look for. If you're growing if you're in an area like the Southeast where you have a very, very long growing season, it's important that you want to have a CRF that releases over a very long period of time, something like 6 months or more. If you're in the Northeast and you have a very short growing window, you might not need something that has an incredibly long release curve to it. As you can see here as well, some CRFs are only just the macronutrients, meaning NPK. As you can see, this triple 14 here, it only is releasing nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and has no micronutrients in it. But on the top right-hand corner, we do have a quote unquote complete or plus CRF that provides NPK as well as some micronutrients. So depending on the situation, you might want something that just produces the macros, or if you're in a container media and you basically have no micronutrients from field soil or your ground, then you're going to need to use a CRF that has micronutrients in it as well. Now, the second major category of fertilizers is water-soluble fertilizers. This is I would say, the number one fertilizer type used on the professional end of things, especially in greenhouse production. Now, we have a big range of products available, and it can be very overwhelming. We're going to go through some of the considerations when we're looking at water-soluble fertilizers. And by doing so, we're going to be looking at the labels, because the labels will really tell us everything we need to know. What you'll notice about water-soluble fertilizers, they're always typically either green or blue, most of the time blue. And the reason for that is it's typically just a colored dye. Tends to not be toxic in any way. But the reason why we have it is so when you're mixing up fertilizer water, you as the applicator know that's fertilizer water, and you don't drink it or don't try to get it on your skin, but it just lets everyone know that it's actually fertilizer water and not drinking water or clear water. That's primarily why we actually have fertilizer dye in the fertilizer. And as I said, there's a lot of different water soluble fertilizers out there. And as you'll see names attached to these. So maybe 21 or 2319 might be petunia feed, or there's poinsettia feeds, chrysanthemum feeds, berry feeds. There's a lot of different water soluble fertilizers out there because they're formulated in general to meet that specific crop's demand. And so when you see the naming, just keep in mind that's why it's been formulated in that way. It's more appropriate for that certain type of crop that you're growing. That being said, just because I'm using a petunia feed doesn't mean I can't use that on other products. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And as you have a more understanding about plant nutrition, we can actually mix and match and use certain fertilizers for a variety of different crops. So if you're starting out and you really have, you walk into like any type of garden center or any type of store or agricultural store that produces fertilizers or sells fertilizers, it can be really overwhelming. There can be thousands or hundreds of different options. So what do you want to do? I would say keep it simple. First things first is try to get a complete fertilizer. So that's going to be something that has macronutrients and micronutrients. A really complete fertilizer is going to have all those things as well as calcium and magnesium. Now, most of the time, you actually don't find calcium in a lot of water-soluble fertilizers, and we'll talk about why that is. It's like baking a cake. Once again, not all of we use a variety of ingredients to bake that cake, but sometimes ingredients are not compatible with each other, and calcium tends to be that way. It becomes incompatible with a variety of things, specifically sulfur and phosphorus. But when in doubt, try to go with a complete fertilizer or a CalMag that has calcium and magnesium, as well as your macro and micronutrients in it. So you may or may have not seen this before. And once again, I'm talking really to a lot of homeowners and just starting out gardeners and growers. When you're working with water-soluble fertilizer and you're growing a large amount of plants, it can be difficult to just mix up one small watering can and go from plant to plant. Oftentimes, especially on the professional side of things, what we do with water-soluble fertilizer is we create something called a stock tank or concentrated stock tank. So we'll actually use a high amount of fertilizer in a small amount of water, and then we'll inject that into whatever our water source is. This is there's a lot of different injectors out there, but this is the easiest, cheapest way to kind of get into using stock tanks and water-soluble fertilizer. This is called a siphon jet or a Hozon, Hozon, siphon jet by Dram on the left. Both of them work in a very similar way. And a lot of these are very inexpensive. We're talking $25 here. As you can see, a photo here it's as simple as basically mixing up a 5-gallon bucket with your fertilizer and a small amount of water, and then hooking it up to your hose faucets. And it allows you to constantly inject water soluble fertilizer and water your plants as normal with fertilizer in it. Very, very easy, very, very inexpensive. Now, when you're kind of moving up in things and trying to be a little bit more complex, you will work with other types of injector technology. I would say one of the most common injectors used in the industry is something called a dosatron. I would look up Dosatron's website. They have a variety of different injectors out there. But even if you're just starting out and even if you have just one greenhouse and it's just too much to water by hand with a watering can, an injector is a relatively inexpensive but also really powerful tool to apply fertilizers as well as insecticides and fungicides. All right, going back to organic fertilizers, it's important we talk about this because I know a lot of growers want to use organic fertilizer even at the home level as well as the professional side. But there's a lot of things there's some considerations, very important considerations that we think about before we really dive headfirst into using solely organic fertilizers. Organics can be liquid or slow release granular formulation. So similarly to conventional fertilizers, they can be in a water soluble sort of format. They can be in a liquid, already basically solubilized format, and they can be in something that's a granular, slow release sort of format. They are typically plant or animal derived. And this is why they're able to be organic, because of where we're getting primarily sourcing our NPK. They also can be a source of secondary and micronutrients, but generally most of our organic fertilizers tend to be just primarily NPK, which can make it difficult to round out an entire organic fertilizer, because oftentimes I can't just use one bag. I have to use multiple components to have an actual comprehensive fertilizer program. Here's some examples of common liquid organic fertilizers. So when I say liquid, it means they actually are liquid. They're going to be a very viscous, very thick sort of solution that we can then either mix into water or directly inject out of them. Now, here's a couple of different companies that provide them: Nature Source, Neptune's Harvest. They are primary producers of liquid organic fertilizers. There's several others within the industry as well. Here's what I meant by slow release or granular forms of organic fertilizer. Now, it's not control release anymore, it's slow release. Now, the difference between this, and unfortunately, these terms are interchanged with the industry, but they're quite different from each other. Conventional fertilizers are control release fertilizers. They have this sort of prill technology that really does a good job of allowing fertilizers to go in or being released to the soil based on temperature and moisture. Whereas slow release organic fertilizers like this, as you can see, they're nowhere near as uniform. They actually look like some sort of composted product. And that's the most times they are. They're granulated. They're relatively, I mean, they can be somewhat size uniformity wise, but as you can see, they're not covered by some prill. They actually will generally release much quicker. Instead of several months, these might happen over a period of several weeks. They still have a lot of value within a fertilizer program, especially for organic producers. But as you can see here, the overall concentrations of these products are much lower. And as I said, they release much faster. It's not just temperature and moisture, it's also microbial activity that has a strong role in the way that they do release over time. So with that being said, this is a little bit of a soapbox. Now, I have to say there are positives to organic fertilization, obviously, environmental safety, obviously having a more added value to an organic product. But unfortunately, the ugly side, the cons to organic fertilization, first one's money. It always tends to be about a magnitude, meaning 10 times more expensive than using conventional fertilizer. And that tends to be a make or breaker, especially on the high level production side. Also, when you're making up a stock tank, a concentrated fertilizer stock tank, we want to use that up in 1 to 2 days. And the reason why is, and it's that exact reason on the left, it builds algae. These sort of organic fertilizer sources are really good at building up algae and biofilm on pretty much any type of hard surface. Wherever there's moisture and fertilizer, you can count on algae and biofilm developing. Also, as I said, some of these formulations are very, very thick, and without diluting them first, we can't actually put them through an injector or a hose on, as we saw earlier. Smell. These do smell as well. I mean, they are from organic source, and they do smell. The odor can also put off people as well. So there's a few things, and I started with the highest, most most significant cons, and then we kind of worked our way down as far as some things you need to think about when using organic fertilizer. Okay, now that aside, we're moving right along. Now we have a better idea of the type of fertilizers that we have available. Let's look at a water test. And this is the first fundamental thing. I don't care if you're a home grower, professional grower, you need to be doing this probably on a yearly basis if you're growing plants. And the reason why is because your water quality changes. Well water changes, city water changes, retention ponds, water quality definitely changes. Water quality will change over time naturally. So it's important for you to get a professional water test from a horticultural lab, probably about every 6 months to a year. And now we're going to go through each of the kind of what are the major things I'm looking for when we look at a water test. As I said, water tests are going to be the primary foundation that we build upon as far as the fertilizer program is concerned. Here's some important parameters that we look at as when we look at a proper water test. Now, if you have a water test available and it's not listing these parameters, most likely that was not the appropriate lab. A horticultural or agricultural lab will attest for all of these parameters or even more things. Unfortunately, sometimes city water, if you go to your municipalities, they will give you a water test by law. Unfortunately, sometimes they don't test for all these parameters, and sometimes it can be limiting. We're going to go through just a few of these briefly. Okay, so once again, this is just an example water test, just run-of-the-mill water test. And the first thing I'm going to look for, and as you can see here, they test for, this is a horticultural water lab that did this, and you can see they test for a variety of different nutrients, pH, soluble salts, and they also kind of give you an optimal range. Now, optimal ranges can be a little deceiving as far as low, optimal, and high. That can definitely change depending on the situation. So I don't want you to fixate too much on those things. They are good references, but I would, if you were especially a professional grower, I would recommend going online and looking at extension papers to really get an idea of what's the optimal range for your crop needs. With that beside, what do I look at first? I'm going to look at soluble salts, or EC, pH, and alkalinity. Now, from this, I can know a lot about water just from these three things. Let's start with EC. Okay, so that was the soluble salts. That kind of tells you, if I looked at all the other salts that were below that test, it kind of adds them up in a way. It adds them up and it tells me how many total salts do I have in my starting water. It's kind of an easier way. It's like, how salty is my water? As we said, there's a lot, all the fertilizers that we use, they are ultimately salts, and they have to be in a salt form for a plant to take them up. So knowing the total amount of salts is an important kind of reference to figure out how much total salts are in our water. So, and also, so EC is primarily attributed through, as I said, the different types of nutrients that are in your starting water. And ideally, I want to be below 1.0. If I'm higher than that, then I have generally pretty salty water, and I need to think about that as I formulate my fertilizer program and how much fertilizer I actually use, because I don't want to build up EC too much. Too many salts actually create problems, and we'll show a few examples of why that is a little bit later. And also, if you build up EC or build up the salts in your media, you'll need to leach, meaning that I use just clear water to try to flush out those salts from basically away from the root zone. That's very important cultural practice. Here's a snippet from a very common fertilizer, 21520 all-purpose. And there, as I said, there's going to be a lot of different things that you'll find on a label. Here are some other really important components. On the bottom left, we have, it gives you sort of some suggestions. Now, these types of plants are very broad. Obviously, plugs or salt-sensitive plugs are basically seedling plugs, really young plants, woody ornamentals, bedding plants, general foliage. As you can see, depending on the type of plant I'm growing, the type of or the amount of fertilizer, which we will measure fertilizer based on parts per million of nitrogen. That's the primary way. So when I'm talking to a grower, I'll say, what parts per million are you growing at? That means what parts per million of nitrogen are you growing with? And that really is only, this is pertinent to water soluble fertilizer. That's important though, because once again, nitrogen is the most important nutrient plants need. And without nitrogen, it really doesn't matter what else we have in the fertilizer. That plant's going to go to not going to be growing on us. So basing our fertilizer program first on parts per million nitrogen is kind of a baseline, and then we look at other things such as phosphorus, potassium, and micronutrients. Also, what you'll find in a lab or on a label is you're going to have mixing instructions. So once I have an idea of the parts per million of nitrogen that I want to feed at, and I can determine if I'm using an injector, And as we saw earlier, the siphon jet or hose on, that uses a 1 to 15 injector. That's why a lot of these labels have that information. They'll have 1 to 15, 1 to 100, and they might have other injection ratios as well. But when you're mixing up fertilizer, it's important to know what type of injector you're using and what sort of ratio it's being injected at. So in this particular label, it's telling us how much fertilizer on a dry ounce, meaning I'll need a weigh scale to weigh out fertilizer. How much ounces by weight of fertilizer am I putting in per each gallon to derive a certain parts per million of nitrogen at a certain injection ratio. But also what's important is the far right column, we have an EC value. So once again, fertilizer in itself will provide salts. Salts equal EC. So they have an EC charge to them. So it's important as well. If I know my starting EC from just my water is 1, and I'm feeding with 50 parts per million of nitrogen, what does that give me? It gives me 0.32 EC. So when I'm reading EC, if I'm actually trying to determine the EC in my solution or in my soil, then my EC should be right around 1.32 because I've added my salts from my original water with the amount of salts in my fertilizer that I'm providing. So bear with me. I know this might be getting a little more complicated, but I'll try to, we'll slow it down again. If you're curious about what parts per million and you're not good at math like myself, and you need calculators to help you sort of mix up fertilizer to meet target ppm nitrogens, there's a lot of good calculators out there, and this is one of the best ones in my opinion. It's called Back Pocket Grower, came out of the University of Florida, and it's just free, online, readily available, and you can just type in, it gives you a variety of different calculators and scenarios, and you can just type in what you're after, and it's going to spit out exactly how to mix up your fertilizer. So if you have any questions, though, as far as how to mix up fertilizer, please feel free to reach out if you can't figure this out using calculators that are readily available. Also, you're probably wondering, well, geez, how do I know what parts per million of nitrogen if I'm growing everything under the sun? And that's a great question as well. Fortunately, there's a lot of good culture guides, plant culture guides available online. Syngenta Flowers is a major plant genetics producer in the country, and they have a great cultural library database that you can just basically, using the link here, that's readily available. Type in the type of plant you're growing, and it might not be their exact variety that you're growing, but if you need some general guidelines for something like a petunia, you can just type in petunia, look at one of their culture guides, and get an idea of the parts per million of nitrogen that you're after, as well as a lot of different cultural input or cultural aspects to growing that plant. So there's a lot of good things out there. Also, a little side note, I hope everyone's familiar with their cooperative extension system within their state. If you're ever, specifically for agriculture, if you're ever looking up something online, let's say petunia iron deficiency, a common problem in petunias, don't just type that in Google. At the very end, say cooperative extension. When you add those words or even just extension, it's immediately going to bring up extension bulletins that are directly written by someone within cooperative extension. They're going to be much more reliable, much more valuable than just something some sort of other page you might read off from the internet. So I would just a little tip of the trade, tools of the trade is add cooperative extension to your little search engine whenever you're looking up something in Google. Okay, so that was EC, talked about salts. Another major parameter is pH. Now, pH, I'm a lot of, if any of you've ever taken a plant biology or plant physiology, plant nutrition course, or even just going through elementary school, I'm sure you saw this one table. Now, this is a very famous table, and what it tells us is it tells us the macronutrients, the micronutrients, and tells us how available they are to the plant depending on the solution or soil pH. Now, as you can see here, most of our macronutrients are well available over a wide pH range, whereas our micronutrients, which are going to be the ones all highlighted here, they're all much more available at lower pHs, meaning more acidic pHs, and they become less available to the plant as our pH rises. There's obviously one exception here with molybdenum. For the most part, the general trend is micronutrients are much more available at acidic pHs. And that's important because that's why when you ever read a culture guide, or if you read a tag on a pot, it'll say the optimal pH range. It's because certain plants like micronutrients in certain quantities. Okay, Petunia group, this is a very just kind of a general name, general nomenclature for this group of plants, are low pH or acid loving plants. And this is the majority of crops that we grow. Most crops that we grow tend to be in that 6.2 or below, 5.3, 6.2 range, somewhere around there on the more acidic side of the pH scale. And the reason for that is they are not good at taking up micronutrients. So they need them to be available and soluble as much as possible. I've listed a variety of crops here that you might be growing in your garden. Petunia being the most common one. That's why we've highlighted it here, and that's why it's called this group. But also to keep in mind, if I'm growing an acid-loving crop and my soil pH goes above soil pH, keep that in mind, soil pH goes above the optimal pH range, then my micronutrients are unavailable, and that plant's going to start to exhibit some micronutrient deficiencies. Now, the other group is, as you know, as you can probably think, is our high pH loving group. It's going to be our basic loving group. We call this geraniums, the geranium group. Geraniums, they're very, just like petunias, very, very common in the landscape, and they like high pHs. And I've listed a couple other crops as well. These crops are they're too good. They're too good at taking up micronutrients, and they don't need them that much. And the problem is if you're growing these crops in low pHs, then they take up too many micronutrients and actually causes toxicity. So that's why it's really important to actually have optimal pHs for your soil. It's because it controls the availability of micronutrients. Now, there's various different factors that affect soil pH. The two, so you can list here, there's four primary ones. The ones I'm going to talk about today are fertilizer, how that impacts soil pH, and then alkalinity of your water. So once again, going back to water, starting water is going to be very important to every other decision we make. Let's look at fertilizer first. So when you look at a quality label, a professional label, it's going to have a variety of things on it, as we've already shown, but it's also going to tell you how acid forming or basic forming it is. Here's a variety of very common water-soluble fertilizers that we're going to see in the industry. Now, you're probably wondering, well, why are we only talking about water-soluble fertilizer? Well, the reality is control release fertilizer does not follow this rule. Control release fertilizer, those little pearls we were talking about, they do not actually have a significant impact on pH. Water-soluble fertilizers are going to be the ones that actually impact either lowering or raising pH. We'll talk about why here in a moment. They're going to have a number on that label. It will tell you if it's potentially acidic or potentially basidic, and it'll have a number by it. The higher that number, the more of it is. So for example, 15015, a very common fertilizer for calcium, it's very basic forming. Whereas you can see here, something like 2177, which a lot of people call like acid hammer, or just, it's a very highly acidic forming fertilizer. It's incredibly acidic forming. So that kind of gives you just an idea of the range of numbers you might see on a label. Okay, here's a snippet of 2010-20, 2010-20, triple 20, probably two of the most common water-soluble fertilizers still used today. And as you can see here, the snippet on the label tells me a lot of different things, but as what we're talking about, at the very bottom, under even the derived from statement, it's going to tell you potential acidity or basicity. Here it says potential acidity, meaning it's going to, the more I use it, the more it's going to lower pH, and gives me that number, 410. As we said, 410 is pretty high. I mean, things can go up all the way to 1,000, but typically anywhere from 300 to 400 of potential units is considered fairly high for that. Now, you're probably wondering, well, why? How does it lower pH? And I don't want to go into the chemistry too much, but look up here under the total nitrogen. It has ammoniacal, meaning ammonium-based nitrogen, and nitrate-based nitrogen. When a plant, this is incredible, but when a plant takes up an ammonium ion, it actually releases a hydrogen ion from its root system. And conversely, when the plant takes up a nitrate ion, it releases a hydroxide ion from its root system. So if we just understand that the more hydrogen ions there are in a system, it's more acidic. The more hydroxide ions there are on a system, the more basic it is. And so just understanding that concept is, wow, a plant is actually doing the acidification itself, not necessarily the fertilizer directly. It's actually the plant acidifying or raising the pH of that soil around its root system. That's just an incredible process that plants do. Here's an example, as we said, 15015, calcium nitrate-based fertilizer. It's a common fertilizer for calcium. And as you can see here, it says potential basicity 200, so moderate. It's going to raise the pH. And the reason why is this does have some ammonium in it, but it has a lot of nitrate. It's got much, much more nitrate in it than ammonium. And thus it's going to be on the basic side rather than the acidic side. Here's you may see this too. This goes way back to what we're talking about. If you're starting out, you need to get a complete fertilizer that's got NPK, calcium, magnesium, and your micronutrients in it. They're on what we call neutral farming and nitrogen and nitrate-based nitrogen to kind of counteract here, but the general ratio is kind of a 1 to 4 ratio. So for percent of ammoniacal nitrogen, I need 4% nitrate to kind of counteract the ammonium lowering the pH and the nitrate raising the pH. But you'll actually see potential neutral formula. That's why it says neutral forming. Okay, so that we talked about fertilizer and how that impacts soil pH. Let's talk about irrigation water again. So when we looked at that water test, it showed alkalinity. Now, alkalinity is bicarbonate, okay? And it can be sourced from calcium bicarbonate or sodium bicarbonate, or even calcium magnesium bicarbonate. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, I've heard calcium bicarbonate. Where have I heard that? That's limestone. So lime is the same thing. It's just alkalinity is dissolved limestone. Easy way to think about that. And depending on where you are in the United States, you can have extremely high amounts of alkalinity dissolved in your water. So alkalinity and think about limestone. You're familiar with limestone because it helps raise the pH. It helps kind of keep that pH where it needs to be and not fluctuate extremely, or definitely can keep that pH higher. So alkalinity, we can think about it the same way. The higher amount of alkalinity I have in my water, the more when I just water naturally, the more alkalinity I'm building up in my root zone. And as I build up alkalinity in my root zone, I'm slowly raising my soil pH. So that's the way you can think about it. You can think about alkalinity as kind of like a plant nutrient, but unfortunately the plant doesn't take it up. It just accumulates over time. And thus, if it's accumulating, then we can run into high pH issues, especially for acid-loving crops like petunia. So going back to our water test, we discussed EC, pH, and alkalinity. Now, I want to talk about pH for a moment. Now, pH and alkalinity, they do have a correlation. Typically, if I have high alkalinity, I tend to have higher pH. But the thing is, the pH of the solution does not tell me anything. I could have, for example, if I didn't even know the alkalinity and the pH said 7, it doesn't tell me what the alkalinity is. It could be an extremely high alkalinity for that matter. So when I ask growers, what's the alkalinity of your water, they always think I'm meaning pH. A specialist is never going to ask you what's the pH of your water. They're always going to ask you what's your alkalinity, because pH is negligible. It really doesn't do anything to actually your soil pH. It's your alkalinity that's actually affecting your pH over time. That's a really, really important concept to keep in mind. Now, as I said, alkalinity is combined, typically associated with calcium bicarbonate or sodium bicarbonate or calcium magnesium bicarbonate. In this situation, that's the next thing I'm looking at. If I look at an alkalinity as 300, that's fairly high. That's going to be very high. Anything really above 150 is considered very high. And so the next thing I look at is, where's that alkalinity formed from? Is it calcium based or sodium based? In this situation, it's both. Fortunately, it's predominantly calcium based, with 90 parts per million being a really high amount of calcium. So I'm probably not going to run into a calcium deficiency with this water, which is fortunate. But there is some amount of sodium as well coming from that alkalinity. Also, it's important to note this now is growers tend to use water softeners, especially if you're in the Northeast or have a high amount of calcium, magnesium, and iron in your water. Do not use water softeners if you're trying to grow plants. What a water softener does is it takes away calcium, magnesium, and iron, but it doesn't have any impact on alkalinity. It just takes away 3 of those really important ions that your plant needs: calcium, magnesium, and iron. The plant loves that. If you already have a high amount of that in your water, the plant's going to eat that up. It's essentially free fertilizer. But if I remove those in the water softening process, I actually replace them with sodium. And so it's what home growers will do is they'll use a water softener and they're saying, gosh, my plants are just burning on me. And it's because they're removing all of their good nutrients with sodium. And the plant, similar to alkalinity, the plant can't take up sodium in high quantities. It just accumulates and actually can create issues, especially a buildup in EC overall. Okay, so we're looking at the water test again. We've gone over EC, pH, alkalinity. We've gone over sodium and calcium. The reason why I'm showing this one is it's a different scenario. We have a high amount of alkalinity, and I'm looking at if it's calcium or sodium based. And unfortunately, this system, this particular water source, it's sodium based. And so when I'm communicating this with the grower, I'm saying, okay, you still have to supplement calcium because you don't have a lot of calcium in your water, and you can develop sodium buildup, and so you may need to leach your plants from time to time, meaning just use clear water, excessive amounts of clear water, to flush out that excessive amount of sodium through the drainage holes of your container, or even just in the ground away from your root zone. So I've given this here. I have to give credit to J.R. Peters. They're the same people who make Jack's fertilizers. They have a great horticultural lab. So if you're in the Northeast, honestly, people over the country use them, and they have a very good comprehensive lab. And so all the lab reports I just showed as examples came from them directly. So fantastic fertilizer company, as well as a great horticultural testing lab. All right, so we're moving right along. So we've covered quite a bit. So we're going to kind of take a breather for a moment, and we're going to kind of go back into first gear, and we're going to round this off with nutrient disorders. And hopefully some of the things we've talked about will sort of highlight some of the concepts we talked about earlier. So let's talk about nutrient mobility and symptom expression. So when you look at a plant, where that nutrition deficiency is or toxicity is will help us determine what specific nutrient that might be. And so easy way to think about this, and I won't read this. I'm actually going to show you a brief image that helps me do this. So there's immobile and mobile nutrients. Okay. So immobile nutrients are things, we got to think about this. A plant is actively growing upwards and outwards. It's using its root system to transport water and nutrients to those actively growing parts of the plant. We call these meristems, the meristematic areas of the plant. As it's trying to take up nutrition from its root system and move it to actively growing parts of the plant, it's trying to put those nutrients that it needs into those growing areas. Now, if for whatever reason I didn't provide enough nutrition at any point during a crop's life, the plant it's looking through its root system, it's looking for those nutrients, and they're just not there. And so what is the plant going to do? It's going to try to break down the nutrition and basically cells of older growth to try to fuel newer growth. And by doing so, it's able to retransport those nutrients into new actively growing areas. The nutrients that are able to do this, we call mobile nutrients, because they're mobile. They can move throughout the plant. Nutrients that cannot do this are called immobile nutrients. So the general trend here is that our macronutrients, NPK, and magnesium are all mobile through the plant, and immobile nutrients, like basically our micronutrients, they can't be moved into the plant. So what does that mean? If I'm an actively growing plant, and let's say I don't have iron, then I can't break down iron in my old growth. And so I'm going to start to see my deficiency in the new growth. If it's a mobile nutrient like magnesium, I'm able to break down that magnesium in the old growth and move it to the new growth. So because I'm doing that, I'm going to see the deficiency first on the oldest growth. And so that gives you an idea of what type of nutrient I'm working with, depending on where the deficiency is occurring. Now, micronutrient toxicity is the opposite of a deficiency. I'm having too much of something. That is always going to occur on the bottom foliage first. It means I've accumulated too much of that nutrient. It's actually causing damage and cell breakdown into the plant itself. We'll show one major example of that here in a little bit. Okay, so this is the common one, hungry plant. So in the professional side of things, we'll look at a plant, it looks overall chlorotic, meaning yellowing, it's stunted, it's not really growing on you. Someone's gonna say they look hungry. It means they're not getting their macronutrients in line enough to be able to really push that plant. And we've given a couple examples here, celosia and geranium. Our macronutrients, they're going to show up first, especially if we're not feeding heavy enough. And as I said, they're all mobile nutrients, so we're going to see them on the lowest growth first. Yes, you'll see some interveinal chlorosis, you'll see some yellowing, you'll see a variety of things. But the first thing you want to think about is that plant growing? The weather, I'm watering well, the weather looks fine. But if that plant's sitting on you, next thing you need to be looking at is make sure I'm feeding enough, because odds are one of my macronutrients is in deficient amounts. This is a common issue too, though, is growers will look at a plant like this bougainvillea, and they'll say, oh, it's overall green, or it's overall yellow, it's chlorotic, it's not moving on me. it's probably macronutrient deficiency. They look very hungry. But what we want to look for too is whenever you look at an above ground issue, and this is primarily for container plants, if you see an above ground issue, you always want to look at the feet. You always want to look at the roots. Oftentimes they can be interconnected. And that's exactly what happened here. A grower came in, they saw, oh, this plant's hungry. I'm going to give it more fertilizer. And they're seeing, oh, it's just continuing to go downhill. It's not getting any better. It's not until they actually took the plant out of its container and looked at the root system where they saw that the root system was jeopardized. In this situation, it was a Pythium root rot, which is a very almost the number one, probably the number one common root rot that occurs on plants. And once again, our root system is kind of our ability to take up water and nutrients. And so when it's compromised, it's going to lead to overall nutritional issues. Goes back to one of the first images I showed you, primary and secondary issues. The primary issue in this situation is the root system's compromised, but the grower is seeing the secondary issue, which is an overall macronutrient deficiency. This is a common way to kind of identify Pythium, or at least something's wrong with the root system, is you walk out to your garden or to the production area and you see very sad plants that they look very wilted. They have no turgor. And what you need to do is you pick up that plant, and if it's bone dry, then odds are there's something, either the plant didn't get watered or there's something dislodged in the dripper or whatever it may be. And so that's an easy correction. You'll water that plant and it'll be back to normal. But what happens if you pick it up and it's saturated? Well, odds are the root system is jeopardized. It's just not able to literally take up water, even though the water is available. So this is what actually happens. I mean, a jeopardized root system, as you can see here, it looks like it's rotting. It's brown. It's not bright white. There's no root hairs. It's really not even developed at all. That plant, once it's under sort of any type of stress like heat or sunlight, it's going to go down quickly because frankly, it just can't cool itself down. It can't take up water or nutrients to thrive. Okay, now this is I'd say probably the main deficiency we see besides macronutrient deficiencies, and that's iron deficiency. As I said, iron is an immobile nutrient. So what does that mean? I can't break it down on an old growth. That means it's going to show up in my new growth first. Iron is incredibly important to chlorophyll production and photosynthesis, and so that's why we see this sort of interveinal chlorosis. The chlorophyll itself in that plant is just not able to produce, not activate correctly, and so we see this interveinal chlorosis, sort of almost this bleach effect on the new foliage. And I honestly, I took this look the other day. We see this all the time when you walking down the street and you see new growth that's bright green, kind of almost fluorescent, and the old growth looks fine. Odds are that's an iron deficiency issue. There's a few ways to correct iron deficiency. We talked about how iron is available at lower pHs. So long term, getting that pH down to where it needs to be, that optimal pH for that crop, is very important. And there's a lot of ways to do that, as we talked about, specifically in this presentation, using the correct acid-based fertilizer. We can also use chelated nutrients. So chelated, a way to think about that is it's a nutrient. We have a nutrient ion, and it's kind of protected. It's protected. I think literally the Greek word for chelate is hug, but it's hugging the nutrient, and it allows it to be available to the plant regardless of the pH, or at least available over a much wider pH range. And so we can use chelated nutrients, and you'll see them sometimes in fertilizer labels. It'll say chelated iron or chelated micronutrient, whatever it may be. And that means it's more available over a wide pH, which is very valuable, especially if you don't have a good control of your pH. We can use chelated micronutrients to quickly correct something, even though our pH isn't where it needs to be. Also, sulfuric acid. I'm not going to go into this, definitely more for on the professional level, but sulfuric acid or battery acid is probably the most primary acid used to bring pH down very, very quickly. And as we showed here, again, using acid-forming fertilizers, very quick way and easy way to lower pH over time. I mentioned this earlier, but once again, there's certain types of fertilizers that are formulated for specific type of crops, and petunia feed is an example of this. You can buy, you can see petunia feed on a lot of different types of fertilizer containers, and it just means that it's one. What do we know about petunias? It loves low pH and it loves iron, so it's going to be acid forming and have a high amount of iron in it. So using acid forming fertilizers or fertilizers that have high amount of chelated micronutrients are ways that I can correct a micronutrient deficiency. I put this in here because it's a general rule of thumb with any type of micronutrient. So When we're applying micronutrients in high quantities, like something at a corrective rate rather than just like a continuous on a continuous basis, we need to be sure to rinse off the foliage. Our foliage is not meant to take up nutrients in extremely high quantities, especially micronutrients. And so it's important when you are applying an iron chelate, which you can buy over the counter, is just rinse off the foliage before it dries. That's very important. We want to put those nutrition where it needs to be taken up, which is going to be the root system. If you're going over the top with a watering can or a hose, whatever it may be, just quickly go over with clear water, rinse that off the foliage because it definitely can burn foliage and flowers, as you can see in this osteo here. Now, let's talk about toxicity for a minute. Now, we can, as I said, there's these high pH loving crops like geraniums, they are already pretty good at taking up micronutrients. But if they are grown at a low soil pH, all of our micronutrients are very, very plant available. And they just unfortunately they can't stop themselves. They'll just indulge and they'll take up too much of it and cause an issue. And once again, what do we say about micronutrient toxicities? They're going to happen at the bottom foliage first. And what can happen is something like this kind of spotting necrotic growth that you can see will quickly go from this to this. And it gets almost like this scabbing effect, like this necrotic scabbing effect, and it only is going to get worse. And so a grower who's not familiar with pH management, they're going to just say, oh, okay, well, once again, it looks hungry. It looks hungry. I'm going to give it more fertilizer. And if they're using an acidic forming fertilizer and they've already got a low soil pH issue, they're just putting fuel on the fire, exactly what's happening here. So you can see that progression. We're starting with a toxicity that's only getting worse and worse and worse and moving itself up through the plant. Geraniums are an ideal model crop for this sort of situation. Magnesium deficiency. So as I said, iron and magnesium, probably the two most common nutrient deficiencies we see. And the reason why is because they're commonly misconstrued for one each other. And think about placement. Placement on the plant is going to help you determine if it's magnesium or iron. Magnesium is mobile in the plant. Now, magnesium, if you look at the chlorophyll molecule, magnesium is that central element of the chlorophyll molecule. So without magnesium, we can't develop chlorophyll very well. And so what that plant's doing in this situation, this vinca, is it's basically breaking down chlorophyll in its older leaves, thus magnesium, and moving it to the new growth where it's actively growing. And so that's why the deficiency is occurring in the lower growth. It creates this sort of interveinal chlorosis, sort of this Christmas tree effect. And I mean, this concept, we actually see it every year. I mean, if you live in any state that has deciduous trees, this is the reason why we have fall color. During the fall time and winter time, basically the plant's breaking down all of its chlorophyll and moving it back down into the root system, not new growing areas, but the root system. And so that's actually why we have fall colors, because of chlorophyll breakdown, which is pretty amazing. This is an example of a Gerber daisy. Similar again, you can see the new growth looks perfectly fine, but the old growth is where I'm starting to see that deficiency first. It's breaking down the chlorophyll, needs that magnesium, needs to move it to its meristematic growing areas. Easy way, I mean, I would say magnesium is one of the easiest deficiencies to correct, because what we'll use is a very readily available fertilizer salt called Epsom salts. People are familiar with them because they use them for a variety of different reasons, but we use Epsom salts / magnesium sulfate all the time when it comes to plant production. And this is the general corrective rates. Generally I'm using somewhere around 3 to 4 ounces per 100 gallons as a corrective rate. A lot of our fertilizers don't have enough Epsom salts or magnesium in them. So generally we can add Epsom salts directly with our fertilizer to kind of boost those magnesium levels. And generally, when you're trying to correct iron or magnesium deficiency, if you catch it soon enough, once you've applied the correct fertilizer, that greens that plant up anywhere from 3 to 5 days of decent weather. Calcium deficiency, this one gets overlooked quite a bit, but calcium is very important to new growth of the flowers and foliage. And so when we have calcium deficiencies, we tend to have abnormal growth, as you can see here. Also, calcium tip burn. If you grow any lettuce or any type of cabbage, kale, any really tender leafy vegetable, you're going to run into calcium deficiencies. So calcium is needed in that new meristematic area. When it's not there, basically the cells won't form correctly and they die. And that's actually what we're seeing. We're seeing that tip burn, that death of the new cell growth. Easy way to correct calcium deficiency is use a calcium nitrate based fertilizer, Also, we can spray calcium chloride dihydrate. If you're a tomato grower, you'll run into this, I guarantee you. That's blossom end rot due to calcium deficiencies on tomatoes. So even fruits, they need calcium to form correctly. If they can't, they're going to literally create that sort of necrotic growth at the tips. We can foliar apply calcium chloride at some rates given here. That's something that can also be bought relatively inexpensively and is safe when used in the appropriate rates. I'm going to round this off by high soluble salts. High soluble salts, as we said, it pertains to EC. If I build up EC too much in my media around my root system, I'm going to burn the roots, and then I'm going to also be able to burn my foliage because I'm not getting the water to the actively growing portions of the plant, as you can see here. CRF, this is a common problem too. When I apply CRF directly on a plant like this, where I rather need to be putting it around the plant and not directly where its stem is or where its foliage is, I can burn crops really, really easily, especially when they're young. So this scenario is just I'm going to end up with a case study. This is a pansy grower, and they're showing us these photos, and they say, well, we planted these, and they're just not growing on us, And I ask, well, why? What's going on? And I said, what are you feeding with part per million nitrogen wise? Go, well, they haven't received any fertilizer, and I go, I guarantee you, if we look at the roots, they're going to look great, which is exactly what's happening. The reality is that plants, they do need nutrition, but they need it in the correct amounts. And that's why I'm leaving you with this note. It's balancing the correct amount of nutrition and the right nutrients to maintain an optimal root system. Plants will do really well if they don't have, from a root standpoint, they'll do really well for a while without nutrition. But obviously, we need to be getting fertilizer on this specific crop. But fortunately, they have a great root system. And so once we do, they're going to start taking off on you. And with that, I thank you for your patience. I know we went over quite a bit. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have now, or if you have any in the future, don't hesitate to reach out using the contact information listed here. Thank you.
Hi, George. Well, there are no questions, so you must have done such a great job throughout. And as you referenced early in the presentation, to peel the onions, to ask questions. Nobody wants to peel the onion today. You've done a great job, answering all the questions that they might have had. So with that, we are going to, again, thank you so much for being here. It's outstanding. Really appreciate you joining us today, and I appreciate everyone who joined the webinar. We will have a recording of this webinar posted on the AIB website later today, and it'll also be posted on the Facebook page. You can learn more about America in Bloom webinars and other programs by visiting our website at America in Bloom. I do want to promote the annual AIB Symposium and Awards program that we'll have coming up at the end of September. We would love to have you join us for this 3-day conference that focuses on helping communities become more beautiful and vibrant places for people to live, work, and play. Visit the AIB website to learn more about this outstanding conference. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and thanks again to George for the great presentation. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.